CBC News Network, and I'm John Northcott. Here's a look at some of the business angles we've been tracking throughout the global pandemic. Extraordinary measures to help stabilize the economy. This week, the federal government unveils a massive $82 billion plan to help Canadians and their businesses, and encourages innovation to help meet the demand for medical supplies. But will it be enough? Border restrictions, Canada, the United States, limiting non-essential travel across the border, but officials say trade will continue. Closing and opening for business. For some companies, there have been layoffs and reduced hours for workers, but others like Walmart are hiring to keep up with the demand for goods. Many of the business angles that we're pursuing on this story we've been tracking all week. A lot to discuss. Joining us now, Elmer Kim is president of Euclid, and Sharina Hussain is a lawyer and assistant professor at the Schulich School of Business. Guys, thanks for cooperating technologically with our isolation and our distancing here. Really appreciate the effort. Let's start with that federal aid package. So $27 billion in direct supports, another $55 billion to help business to maintain liquidity through tax deferrals and a whole variety of things. Is it enough at this stage? Sharina, do you want to start us off?
I think it's a great start, and especially because in this time in which there's a considerable amount of uncertainty, not just in terms of stock markets, but also when it comes to private businesses that are making the decision whether or not to keep their doors open or keeping employees on payroll. The leadership that we're currently seeing as to not only put in place significantly and quite a breadth of aid packages online is great, but also the message that it's sending that there could be more to come as we begin to see the more of the long-term implications that the COVID-19 pandemic might have. And a good example could come in the context of payroll taxes and the opportunity for some smaller businesses to have a temporary wage subsidy come into place. That can help alleviate some of the short-term implications that these small businesses might have when it comes to deciding whether or not to keep an employee on payroll or not.
And yet we've seen examples of the United States, $1 trillion+, the UK up to 75 to 80% of some salaries being supported by the government there. Elmer, do you think at this stage the federal government in this country is doing enough?
Well, clearly they're going to start stepping up their support. Like, to give the context, you talked about, John, in the U.S. for $1 trillion of support. That's approximately 5% of their U.S. GDP. I was on a couple of conference calls with investment banks and economists in the U.S. This past week, and they're talking about the U.S. government putting in up to close to 15% of their GDP, which should be up to $3 trillion. These guys are actually going to war. To give you a context, in France, they're giving about 3% of their GDP. Canada's about 1%. I think we can afford to go a lot more. I also think it's imperative that we go hard and fast. There is no stepping, we know what the path of this pathogen is going to be. We know the impact on the job losses is. And I think the confidence, how quickly we bring actually confidence into the system is going to be critical. And how you get confidence into the system is you got to give assurance to people that their jobs will be there. And then we saw the 500,000 EI application that happened this week. We're going to see another 500,000 next week. So the quicker we get confidence back into the system, the quicker the recovery for the economy will be, because we know there's going to be a recovery. It's the question of how long it's going to get to get there. So the quicker the governments work, I think it's great. I think the dollar amount is important, but just as importantly is how fast the money actually gets into the hands of the consumer and the employees as well. So there's a whole bunch of tactical ways they can get the money in, but I suspect it's being gummed up right now is to figure out how do you get that $27 billion into the system quickly. They certainly announced that $10 billion through EDC and BDC, which is very helpful for the small businesses and companies in Canada. But clearly they have to figure out how quickly they can get into the actual bank accounts of everybody involved.
Well, we've seen crises like this before. We haven't seen a crisis quite like this, but we've seen crises where there was a difficulty with the stock market, where there were a lot of layoffs within particular industries. But we're talking about massive layoffs. We're talking about some industries that have literally ground to a halt. And we have a situation where no matter how much money you give people, it's certainly not going out to spend it on anything because everything's closed. This is just to keep a roof over their head. So let's talk about that recovery, especially for small business. What might it look like and what would it take? Sharina?
So I think this is going to be an instance whereby the degree of confidence that consumers as well as businesses have in terms of the ability to recover in piecemeal will be critical. And there's actually a really interesting theory that's floating around by Yale economist Robert Shiller about this being a co-epidemic. The first and foremost being the public health crisis known as COVID-19. The second being almost the narrative epidemic as it relates to the degree of outlook and confidence that the public has that there will be a recovery. And also the question, of course, is how quickly is that narrative changing to getting from possibly optimistic in terms of looking 6 to 12 months out to being possibly very pessimistic in the sense that the world is changing dramatically and retirement savings are potentially wiped out. So with that in mind, being able to instill the confidence that we're in this together and being able to build in place some resiliency into our business models is now more important than ever. And right now, it might seem a bit paralyzing in terms of what you can do or not do, but also to be able to think ahead as to maybe now is a good time to rethink how our businesses might have to change. Should there be, say, a second wave, or the recovery might take a bit longer? What can we do to make our businesses more resiliency? For example, keeping more cash on hand, being more mindful of our supply chains, as well as how consumers might behave if they're less able to go out and shop, but still have some cash on hand on the basis of these stimulus packages that are coming from governments.
Well, to Sharina's point, though, how can you spend enough money to instill confidence? How do you put a price on confidence?
Well, the price on confidence is infinite. So the whole system, the analogy here is we're trying to change an airplane engine in the middle of a flight. The policymakers and certainly the central banks and boards of companies have never actually dealt with this, and they've actually never gone to school, never been told, myth and stories of how this would ultimately work if the entire country comes to a halt for not one day or 1 week or potentially weeks at a time. So what Sharina's talking about is right, and I think everybody's talking about how do we get confidence back into the system, stay calm, collected, and we're going to come out of this all okay. But at the end of the day, we need to add liquidity into the system. So whether the government pumps whatever it takes to pump liquidity into the system is going to be critical. It's going to be critical for individual companies to actually outlast how long this may potentially be. And as consumers, as individuals, you're going to have to now plan around how long you're going to have to be able to survive this. Now, to all of that, part of it is the consumer actually has to have cash in the bank to pay for rent and for food. So we've now seen some deferrals of mortgages. We've seen some feedback that Canadian banks may not be participating as aggressively in that deferral programs as warranted. We know that some of the cities have deferred taxes and utility payments. So I think all of this kind of helps. But at the end of the day, I think that what we need to do as a policymaker, and you're going to start seeing it, is we need to helicopter money down to the consumer. If you remember in the 07, 08, 09 crisis, what we did to add confidence into the Wall Street and the Bay Street world was the term was they helicoptered money to the banks. We don't care who gets it, how it comes through, but the confidence that the banking system is going to work has to exist. So they dropped in trillions of dollars to do that. Now, that caused other problems later on down the line, but it actually got the banks and the banking system to run. What we need to do now is we actually physically need to drop thousands of dollars every month to every Canadian consumer so that they can go out and say, you know what, tomorrow's going to be okay. And you heard that out of the U.S. They're now contemplating giving $1,000 a month to every Canadian American taxpayer so that they can go about their normal lives and without having to worry about whether or not they're going to be able to put food on the shelves, food on their table from the shelves. So I think confidence is critical, and I think we all talk about. I've been talking about with some of my colleagues and my peer group, saying, how much is it going to cost? That's not the question. If we do not do this, the opportunity cost will be so massive and so immense that it's going to be damaging for generations. So I think today the action is, how do we get the consumer back comfortable enough to say tomorrow will be okay?
Those of us who have listened to older relatives talk about what life was like in the Depression or, for example, in the Second World War, are getting a taste of that with the federal government reaching out to companies in order to meet the demand for healthcare supplies, essentially putting it on a wartime footing. Let's listen to the Minister of Innovation and Science, Navdeep Bains.
We want Canadians to know that as solutions are offered, we will invest to make sure that more domestic capacity is online as quickly as possible.
Okay, so get ventilators into the hands of people who need it, repurpose companies. What are the challenges for industry? I think maybe supply chain might be part of it in terms of what elements are made in this country. Sharina, how do you think this might play out on the industrial scale in this country?
Well, using the example of the ventilators, we have to recognize that there is a regulatory and a testing phase that has to be met in order to bring online those ventilators sooner rather than later. So I do applaud the initiative as it relates to getting industry to rethink and retool to bring such things online. But that being said, it's not necessarily going to happen overnight. There could be 2 to 4 to 6 weeks in terms of testing, retooling, getting those supply chains ready, and then being able to get the green light from the regulatory authorities to then mass produce those ventilators, for example, in the quantities that are ultimately needed. So I think, again, applaud the initiative, and it's going to start to stimulate the rethinking and retooling. But that being said, it's not going to be a flip-the-switch response. It will take time before we begin to see those products come online.
Elmer, your thoughts?
I think that's right. So that's completely right. And I think as well, what the government's trying to do there is, I think, you learn, the Minister Baines, look how calm he was. He said, look, this is coming along. We got a game plan to make sure that our equipment's going to be available for our doctors and nurses and frontline workers. It's coming along. Let's do our part, stay away from one another at least 6 feet, so that, we talk about flattening the curve, but maybe just, dropping the curve as well as fast as we can, so that the system can kind of catch up to the disease. So, it's all good. I think that there's a little bit more to be done. I think, what we saw, clear example, what happened in Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong to solve their problems, as well as in China, almost draconian methods and methodologies to separate people, to set up temporary first-line hospital care systems. And, I don't think there's a lot of concern as to whether or not, we've got all of the, labeling and the requirements that this ventilator is going to work or not. I think the ventilator is better than nothing, and is that kind of pacing that has to be done. But I think speed matters for everything that we do, because this thing is doubling about 20%, it's going up 20% a day.
Guys, we've just got about 30 seconds left, but quickly I wanted to ask you, what else stood out for you this week, or what should we be watching for in the next week? Sharina.
We should look at the resiliency of our telecommunication infrastructure. At this point in time, we are relying upon our Wi-Fi, our broadband quite extensively. And as the kids from March break come back, they're going to be burning through that. So keep an eye for that.
Okay, Elmer, bring us home.
Well, I'm hoping that the banking system and the confidence in our system continues. We need to have some recovery in the stock market to give everybody a little bit of comfort. But, I think the positive news is our leadership's been, rock solid from my perspective.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. We will, I suspect, unfortunately, be dealing with this again in the coming weeks. But that wraps up this week in Business News. Thanks for joining us on the Weekend Business Panel. Elmer Kim, president of Euclid, and Sharina Hussain is a lawyer and assistant professor at the Schulich School of Business. Remember, you can watch the Weekend Business Panel every Saturday right here on CBC News Network.